Hello and welcome to Clipping In. In this video we're going to shine the spotlight on the autumn winter bike for 25-26. I thought I'd start with a reasonably concise summary of what it is before moving on to some of the thinking behind the choices of why it is. So here we have it. Begin with the frame and fork. It is a Dolan badged titanium frame, single butted, some nice curving seat stays there, carbon fork, both of which can accommodate mudguard drillings, so you can fit full length mudguards, traditional style. And you can see if we move down here into there, we've got a bridge between chainstays, so the mudguard goes all the way down, maximum protection there. It's running a 105 11-speed mechanical group set, titanium seat post. I thought I'd go for that as over carbon. You know, titanium, I always fancied them. They always had a reputation in the 90s of being comfortable, a little bit soft but comfortable, and I thought, right, this is the opportunity to get one. And you can see the tyres are Continental GP4 season. I've swapped my summer bike. If we say the summer bike is the Cannondale Super 6 Evo, I normally run GP5000 with latex tubes. Here I'm running butyl tubes and 25mm tyres, GP4 season. They actually, on these rims, they blow up to about 26. There's clearance with the guards for 28s, and I think without guards on this you'd easily be able to put 30s on. The reason why you can do that is there's clearance on the fork, there's clearance on the frame, and the brakes, which we can have a look at now, a TRP, which is a branch of Tetra, and they are long drop dual pivot rim brakes. Now normally long drop brakes, they have a reputation of being a bit soft and a bit spongy. I've had some in the past, some giant Ohm brand long drop dual pivots, and they were terrifying to ride in hilly country. Wheels, it's not a matching pair. On the back you can see DT Swiss PR 1600, that's about a 30mm rim depth, and on the front that's a Mavic Cerium, so it's 25mm rim depth. Nice braking surfaces on both of them. That makes a big difference. When you get a nice machined braking surface, you're not getting off-putting vibration when you're braking, and it also helps, I think, when you're in wet conditions. It helps to, when you're doing what I think of as ABS style braking, to dry the rim. We've also got a vintage saddle, that is the model's own. Dates back to 2001 or 2002 and was bought at a bike shop only a few miles from here. Classic saddle. Weight wise, I think people always like to talk about that on bikes, don't they? And people are often very, very creative when it comes to quoting their bike weights. They omit all kinds of things. I know people take bolts out, and I've even seen somebody taking the rubber grommets out of carbon frames and replacing it with insulating tape. Well, this bike, ready to ride in its winter guise, cages, pedals, guards, reflectors, lights, but not seat pack, is 9.4 kilos. And that also includes the winter tyres and the butyl tube. So as we see it now, minus the seat pack, 9.4. Dolan termed this an endurance geometry, by which you can see it's an extended head tube compared to a racing frame. For me, who's used to riding racing geometries, I find the front end's quite high. So yeah, spacers on top of the stem, and also a little tip there, if you're going to run your stem this way with spacers on top, make sure that you've got a long enough steerer plug. A lot of steerer plugs that are supplied are very short, and it would mean if you run spacers on top, the steerer plug only just reaches the steerer. Here I fitted an extra long steerer plug, no problem there. I'm very pleased with it. Like I say, I've had it for about 4 years, and it's been previously it's been looked after in that it's been cleaned up, put into hibernation in October, and then re-emerges in March. And it's been, for want of a better description, my long distance bike. I've done some 200, 220k rides on it, and it's a bike that leaves you feeling full of riding, I think, after that kind of a distance, whereas a stiffer, more efficient bike might beat you up a little bit more. People often talk about the miracle of the titanium ride. I think there's a little bit of marketing surrounding that, but in my experience, it achieves that comfort by being a little bit softer. In other words, if you want to do repeated sprints and performance critical type riding, I don't think this is stiff enough for you. But if you're going to get it up to speed and just tick the miles off and roll for long distances and long durations, that's when it comes into its own. It's a very comfortable bike, and it's doing that really at the expense of stiffness and ultimate efficiency. An interesting comparison would be over the summer when I was riding this back to back with the Super 6 Evo. I found speed differences. So in other words, for the same input power, same input efforts from me, there was a speed difference between this bike and the Evo. And roughly speaking, on typical base rides, it amounted to around 0.5 miles an hour. So this setup, summer guys with summer tyres, summer tubes, but still with guards, was around 0.5 miles an hour slower than a summer bike. What I've found since then, applying similar back of the envelope comparisons, now that I've changed the tyres up, now that I've changed the tubes, it's around 1.1 to 1.2 miles an hour slower than a summer bike. I still think that's a price worth paying for what we're thinking of as year-round riding in all kinds of conditions. I think what you have to do before you can build or even specify a winter bike, you have to define what conditions you're facing in your area for winter cycling. And at this point, you shouldn't be knocked off course by people who are trying to gatekeep or be the arbiters of authenticity when it comes to winter conditions. You know the kind that I mean. They'll say, oh, those conditions where you live, that's not winter. You'd be lucky if that even qualifies as autumn. You know, that kind of thing, it's not helpful, because wherever you are, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, you are now facing an autumn-winter run of maybe 5 months of inclement weather that is significantly different to that you encounter in your summer riding, and it's bad enough to make autumn-winter riding unpleasant, unsafe, or shall we say injurious to your health. Realistically, unless you live on the equator, you're going to face some kind of autumn-winter. Incidentally, this channel is very popular in Ecuador. I'm aware of that. Hola, bienvenidos a Clipping In. That's to the Quito posse. So you're facing your winter conditions, and it will also depend on the area that you live and the country that you cycle in. I've said before that the Pennines, where I've done most of the riding this year for Clipping In, they're almost half a season ahead of the valleys. I've said before about every 300 feet or every 100 meters of height that you gain, you can knock a degree Celsius off the temperature. So it's half a season different. So if you're going to persist in cycling in those kinds of areas, again, you have to factor that in. You have to allow for that. But once you've defined your area and your cycling conditions that you have to face and prepare for, you then have to be honest with yourself about the kind of cycling that you're going to do at winter. You know, are you going to have a period where you switch to the trails and do gravel or trail riding for a bit? I used to enjoy that in the old racing days. I would find that when a racing season ended in early October, I was ready for a break because I'd been doing concentrated training, focused, specific training from Christmas, New Year, right up to the beginning of October. There was travelling to races and all the rest of it on top of that, and I just wanted a break. I wasn't fed up with cycling, I was fed up with structured cycling. So I used to pull out a hardtail mountain bike and take to the trails, and I loved it, and I'd do that for maybe 8 to 10 weeks. And then come Christmas, New Year, I'd switch back again, saying, right, get ready for the roads. But that trail riding didn't do me any harm at all. And you might decide that that's what you want to do over at least half of autumn, winter. And you might be a person that's much happier on the roads, and therefore you're going to keep your road riding going. And, you know, I often say that if you don't have a racing season, if you don't have a competition season, then you don't have an off season either. You don't have an outer competition season. You just ride through. And there's lots of people who do that. There's lots of people who ride Audaxes right through the year. So, you know, it all depends on your preferences and your duty cycle. There isn't a right way and a wrong way to do cycling. Now, I put a video out about a month ago saying, asking a question really of Castelli when they said, you know, no one rides in the rain anymore. And that wasn't an attempt at gatekeeping. It was simply, you know, are you sure about that? Because some people still do ride in the rain, although we accept that fewer people ride in the rain than they used to. And that might be because they can pick and choose their days. They might have very flexible working hours. They might be retired, or they might find indoor training, all the options that you've got now of online indoor training, they might find that more than stimulating enough to avoid the bad weather outside, the weather that they don't like. And again, no right way or wrong way of doing it. And therefore, if you're going to avoid those kinds of conditions, you don't really need to think about having a specific cold, wet weather bike. Similarly, if you don't enjoy riding when there's ice around, either you think it's too risky, or you struggle with your breathing, or there's a host of reasons why you might not want to do that. No one can tell you that that's wrong. That's your way of doing it, and you do what you're happy doing. And if you're happy doing it, you'll do more of it, and you'll do it for longer. Win-win. I wish I'd taken some of that advice myself. In December 2005, I'd had a real pile of disruptions through the autumn, and I didn't think that my training and fitness was where it should be. And come December, I was starting to feel a little bit edgy about this, because you know that the races are going to start in March and April. They're not going to wait for you. The races are there, and if you're not fit, too bad. So yeah, I was starting to get a little bit panicky. And one day, when there had been a very hard frost and the temperatures were still low, I went out on my bike. And to be fair, I'd got 40 miles in without a vent. And then one descent, north facing, I came off at about 35 miles an hour and took one almighty impact. I broke my right collarbone. I smashed my ribs up, and I gave my head one heck of a bump. I was seeing stars for days. And needless to say then, I didn't ride a bike for nearly 3 months. I got on the indoor trainer as soon as it was practical, you know, with my arm in a sling, but I couldn't breathe properly because my ribs were smashed. So that one ride where I felt fear or insecure cost me 3 months of potential nice days when I could have got out and ridden on roads that weren't icy. So ultimately, when you take that decision, you're the one, if anything goes wrong, you're the one that has to deal with it. So again, don't let anyone else influence you. If you see that on ride sharing, on social media, on YouTube, there are people going out and having all kinds of adventures in those conditions, it doesn't mean you've got to follow suit. Stick with what you know, stick with what you're happy with, and even if you don't ride outside in any particular volume between November and March, it doesn't matter. If you're happy doing it and you may be getting your fix of fresh air and green space in other ways, then stick to your indoor trainer. And come March, then you'll be roaring fit and ready for action when the weather improves. So again, you know, do it your own way. I think once you've defined what your way is and what your requirements will be, that's when you can start putting a spec together. When I look back at my training diaries from the late 90s and through the 2000s, one thing I noticed really for the first 7 years of that spell, I didn't really have a winter bike. What I had was the previous racing bike, a bike that I'd raced, I think 2 road races, half a dozen time trials, and even a couple of sportives. So it was a competitive machine. But when I got a better one, I thought, oh, I'll fit guards to it, and that'll be my training bike. So what I really had was a bike that I could train on in inclement weather all year round, and one that would see a lot of service at winter when the weather is more inclement. But it was a bike that was still, it felt like a racing bike. It had responsiveness. It had that urgency of a racing bike, rather than being some kind of slow, sluggish, demoralizing kind of machine. I know I've had those too, but that bike that I had for 7 years was something that I had raced on, and you could do anything on it. There were even examples in the early 2000s when I was up at Carlisle. I rode down Lawton Vale, I went over the Winlatter Pass, down to Thornthwaite and Braithwaite, signed on. I did an evening 10 on it, mudguards and all, flaps on the back, give it everything, got back, picked my stuff off a friend, put my jersey back on, had a look at the results, rode home. So, you know, it was a super training sandwich. And even though I knew that I was giving away about 1 minute 30 by racing a 10 on that bike, it didn't matter. It was maximum commitment, and it was a bike that still gave you enough back that you felt you were encouraged to attack something like an evening 10 on it. Whereas a pure winter slogger of a bike would just wring all the enthusiasm out of you. I know that, you know, if you put some really heavy-duty bomb-proof tyres on there, they'll cost you 2 to 3 miles an hour before you factor anything else in. Now, if the kind of riding that you're wanting to do at winter is not speed critical at all, then that heavy bike with the 3 mile an hour tyres might be the bike for you. But back then, it wasn't the bike for me because, you know, I was ultimately aiming at racing, and my riding was more about training than just the joy of riding. That was really in my mind for this winter. And I thought, what I want to do this winter is something slightly different. I want to have a bike that is responsive, that feels lively. And that's why what I did in June, shortly after being stung on the eye by that wasp, I had 5-6 days enforced layoff where I could only go on the indoor trainer. So I caught up with little jobs. And one of the jobs I caught up with was fitting full-length SKS guards to the ADX Titanium. And I thought at first it would be an all-weather bike that I might not necessarily use for winter. That wasn't first and foremost in my thoughts. But the more I rode it, I realised that with this, as I mentioned earlier, about 0.5 mile an hour speed penalty. And that was not all entirely due to the guards. Some of that is due to the frame being softer and more compliant. And that's when the little cogs started turning, and I thought, well, really this, with one or two concessions to autumn winter, could make a really nice, enjoyable bike. Because ultimately, we're facing 5 months of inclement weather. It hasn't actually turned yet. We've been eased into October quite nicely. But when the weather does start to turn, perhaps when we go from British summertime into Greenwich Mean Time, then we're facing around 5 months of that kind of weather. And the kind of riding that I'll be doing on clipping in, a lot of it on camera, will be very similar to what I do at summer. So I'll be going out for 4 hours, 5 hours, an occasional 6. And having guards and having slightly more robust tyres will be a benefit. But I'll still have that feeling of a bike that wants to work with you, rather than something that you're pushing hard against and that just doesn't want to cooperate. I think there's a tendency sometimes to think of a bike as, well, it's good enough for winter. It'll do. It'll get me through. But when you think that, and I'm using autumn, winter almost interchangeably, when you think that you're facing 5 months of that, that's a long time to be on a bike that's not responsive and a bike that you just simply don't enjoy riding. And if you're hopefully going to get out 4 or 5 times a week, having to face that tractor of a bike, with everything else that's going on, you know, it can be slightly discouraging. Well, I started this video with the idea of being concise, and I think when I was outside with that patchy fog that I achieved that. I managed it. That section was quite short, but then I almost knew that once I got in here and I started talking about the reasons why I had an idea then that I might start spreading out a little bit, and I think the running time now is extending. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to draw a line here. Hopefully some of this thinking aloud will prove helpful in your bid to build or specify a winter bike, and will help in the months that are ahead, because there's still a lot of good, satisfactory, enjoyable cycling ahead. Even if you are cherry-picking days, the days will be there. So, you know, don't give up, don't lose heart. I'll be out there over the autumn, winter, all being well, and you will be too. That's all for this edition of Clipping In. I will see you very soon back out on those Yorkshire roads. Bye-bye.